clear away. I'm going to try to keep things moving along now. I love the questions and the discussion in the chat box here. Sure, and I just will apologize if you're asking me personal questions while we're going. I will respond to you as best I can while I'm keeping the session going. I want to do an exercise here. We're moving into our next segment. What do you want your THPO to do? And we've been touching on a lot of these points already, assuming duties and responsibilities from the THPO. What's within the scope of the agreement that you end up working out, and the many hats that THPOs wear. So I'm going to try to get fancy here and ask you to do a little group exercise here. I emailed a question in advance, and presumably you are all as busy as I am, and so didn't get any answers, but that's okay because I'm going to ask you the same question here. And share my screen.
Oops.
So this is going to be a real-time word cloud populated by your answers. And what I need you to do is go to menti.com on your own, open up a browser on your phone, on your computer, either one, menti.com, and enter the number that you see here. It will give you this question. THPOs wear many hats, depending on the needs and wants of their tribe. What are the 1 to 2 primary functions that you want your tribe's THPO to perform? And we're going to talk about the range of what those can be. You also got a handout of the THPO functions and responsibilities that are listed in the regulations. But before we get into what the official answers are, including some from our experts here, we want to hear what you think. What are your impressions? What are your hopes for what you'll be doing here? Go to menti.com, enter that code, that number that you see there. And then once you start to type in your answers, there we go. We will see what you guys think you want to do as a THPO or want your tribe's THPO to do. Seeing some common threads here. You can type in 1 answer, 2 answers. You can do it again if you want. I'll let this run for a minute. Give folks some time to answer. We've got 71 participants in the meeting. This is amazing. 23 responses here. Preservation, educate, protection. Just going to give folks 1 more minute to go to menti.com, type in that code, type in your answers. And then I'm going to turn it back over to John. And we're all finished looking at the word cloud here, and John is going to talk about, again, a very brief overview of the roles and responsibilities, introducing those SHPO functions that we've already kind of touched on, obligations under that Park Service, that DOI agreement, and the Park Service grant that Everett's been talking about, and in relation to the wants and needs of your particular tribe, of your community. We're going to do that for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we're going to segue into a panel discussion with some guiding questions for our experts, our trainers, and then we're going to see if we need a break before 3 o'clock Eastern. Well, this was really cool, you guys. Thanks for participating. Got 40 responses here.
My idea was that we would just leave the word cloud in place and have a conversation really about it, because it's got already this amazing bundle of expressions of creative ideas.
Okay, take it away, John.
And, you know, I think from my vantage, and I, keen to hear what, my colleagues, both, sort of designated as trainers and others, have to say. Like, there's all kinds of interesting ways that one can partition, and we already started doing it, what THPOs do. Eric and Everett, mentioned those things which are funded by the federal grant system that provides support for THPO functions, but seldom sufficient by way of funding to do more than provide the most bare bones kind of work. And so that's one way of separating things out. Another way of separating things out might be useful, and I'm inviting comments on this as well, is which elements of sovereignty are being advanced through which of these functions? How are the words that are appearing in the word cloud contributing to different parts of the exercise, assertion, expansion of sovereignty? For example, Eric had mentioned the extraordinary importance of self-representation, of making certain that tribal voices are telling tribal stories. At least that's what it means to me. So which of these words contribute to that? Which contribute to self-governance? All of them? Only some of them? What else should be added in order to clarify the importance of self-governance? What else might be added to clarify the importance of self-representation? What else might be added to contribute to, like, self-sufficiency and assuring that there's, solvency and a layer of requisite capacities on the part of the tribal government in order to fulfill its obligations to its people and its lands, past, current, and future? What other words should be added or amplified in order to make that the case? And then the last thing that comes to mind by way of, partitions or whatever of sovereignty is pure recognition. What else needs to be added here in order to ensure the proper and lawful conduct of relationships on a government-to-government basis, nation-to-nation, government-to-government, with both state and government, and federal entities? So maybe there's other good ways of separating these things out. When you start off with the fundamental importance of where the funding is coming from and whether or not the money that we are going to receive in a THPO program is going to be sufficient in order to do everything that the community is asking of the THPO, then it opens a real conversation for the efficient administration of a THPO, as well as for a bigger conversation about what other forms of support would need to be provided by the tribal government or from other sources, whether those be grants, entrepreneurial activities, the FCC, then, pathways that were discussed earlier. And so I think, at least from my point of view, the critical role and the thing that THPOs do, even if they had no idea that they were going to end up doing this, is being effectively entrepreneurs. The word that comes to my mind are orchestrators, individuals who are looking constantly both for consolidating what they do well and expanding that to do more and better on both a more efficient level and by serving more diverse sets of values and interests within the communities they serve. That's plenty out of me.
Thanks, John. Looking ahead, we are actually going to get into the functions and responsibilities question pretty intensively at 3:30. So we're starting to get just a few minutes behind here. Thanks, John, for saving us some time. We are going to segue into this facilitated panel discussion, and we've come up with some guiding questions for our experts. I believe I stopped sharing this one there. That was really great, everyone. Thanks for playing. All right, discussion time. Everett, Eric, Michonne are the folks who we have named in this, but as I mentioned earlier, if you have answers or experiences that you would like to share to these questions that we're going to ask, then please, by all means, do chime in. So this is our 2:15 session. Why do THPOs do what they do? And to share my screen again.
I had the historian role, but I'm just going to make one more comment about the current historical moment in which we find ourselves. And this is something that I think is important for tribes in general, but maybe especially important for THPOs, is hold on to your hats, because there is about to descend into tribal communities an unprecedented level of federal funding for infrastructure projects and for all kinds of other work that has been needed to do. And this is courtesy of the new ARPA. And I can't even remember what it stands for basically, but the next round of COVID relief funding. So a lot of money is about ready to show up. And to the extent that THPOs have what I'll call shovel-ready proposals in hand in order to spend those funds, whether it's for expanding a curatorial facility or doing other much needed work that has been endorsed and approved by their governments. I think there's much to be said about the possibilities of being towards the front of the line to get some attention for those sorts of funding programs. I don't think very many people know very much about how this is exactly going to go down, and much of it depends on the conversation within individual tribal governments. But there is about ready to be more money in Indian country than there's ever been, at least in my lifetime.
And that's a really good point. Those conversations about funding for THPOs, especially in the next infrastructure, in the infrastructure package and any other COVID relief bills, are something that NAPO is involved in here. But we could have an entire separate workshop on funding. So I'm going to try to stick to the sort of agenda that we've outlined here. David Whedon, I see your comment there. That's a good one. And I also see that Lance Foster has popped in, the THPO and vice chair for the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska has introduced himself in the chat box, and he is also an THPO board member. So Lance, I'm going to put you on the spot, and I'm sharing my screen here. This session, Why Do THPOs Do What They Do, is intended to be a facilitated panel discussion. And so I would invite you to offer an answer to this question. Is there an aspect of tribal sovereignty, self-determination that THPOs are especially equipped to advance? Are they able to be effective at it?
For me, I think it really depends on the tribe. Every tribe is handling these things different. Some tribes, the THPOs are very much under other, not only the executive committees of the tribal council, but they are under cultural committees, and they have to work a lot of different ways. And some have very big offices under cultural programs and such. Some of us are just like one-man shows, so to speak, although I'm lucky enough to have Alan with me now. So that's going to help quite a bit with compliance monitor stuff, especially. I think that we are in a particular position to act as umbrellas. I mean, we have our mandated doing the compliance work within the reservation boundaries on our tribal lands. But we can, as Eric and others have said, I mean, Nishan talked about putting your message out far beyond those boundaries. We have about 9 states that we encounter, that we include as part of our Aboriginal homeland. So we work with anybody and everybody. And a lot of it is, I mean, we work in every day of the year on this stuff. Funding ever since our TC&S program went south, as far as getting funding up front from that, we don't have as much funding to grow programs as we did at one point. So, and as Eric and others have mentioned here, it's hard to get funding for these. We're all competing with each other. We have to be very creative and entrepreneurial. And then at such a point, there comes into competition with other of our fellows, as well as almost inherent conflicts of interest in some of these things that we have to be careful about. Climate change, as Letitia's saying, is there's resilience. We do some of that. We do NAGPRA work. We do culture work. We're trying to develop programs with our tribal national park that we developed. So it's a growing time, and it's going to be, anything that came before isn't the way it is now. So, but I think we're able to be an umbrella like few others are able to, depending on your tribe and how you're arranged, and how the authority structures arranged there.
Okay, thanks, Lance.
Mm-hmm.
Everett, you're unmuted.
Yes. I wanted to address this by stating that for some tribes, they may live directly on their ancestral territory, or there's some tribes that have been removed. For example, most of the tribes in Oklahoma were removed at least somewhat. They may be on traditional hunting land perhaps, but they're not where they were originally. And one of the aspects of sovereignty that a THPO allows you to have is you need to respond. You have Section 101 D2 authority on projects that are located on trust land. But projects that are located off of trust land, for example, throughout your ancestral territory, you have the ability to become a consulting party with the federal government whenever they send you a notification. And then through that, you're able to make sure that your tribe's sites that are located off of your reservation boundary can be considered as the federal government does their projects. And to me, that's one of the largest things, especially for a removed tribe. Perhaps a smaller tribe that lives on their ancestral land where they've always lived, perhaps maybe that's not as big of a thing. But for a removed tribe, you have no ability to make sure that your sites are taken into effect or into consideration. If you don't have a THPO that's actually really working, you can show up and you can try and do things, but the government, you need a THPO who actually knows the regulations. You need a THPO who actually has been designated by MPS as an official representative of your tribe. And they allow you to do that to make sure that places like our traditional mounds where we come from for removed tribes, places like our burial sites are not just plowed through. And you know, the government is supposed to not do those things intentionally. They're supposed to plan for those things, even if the tribe doesn't get involved in the process. But let's all be blunt and honest. We know that it doesn't happen. The government goes through and plows through things all the time, and sometimes very intentionally. And if you don't have a THPO who knows what they're doing, your sovereignty is impacted by that. Your history is impacted by that. Your unique identity as a people is impacted by that. And that to me is one of the biggest things that a THPO is there for.
So
Okay.
I'd like to, if I could, I just would like to say that first, hi Lance. I haven't seen some of the NATHPO folks because I'm not on the board anymore. But I do want to say that you know, we have a lot. You can hear kind of the THPOs that have been around for a while. We're saying a lot of words. We're saying a lot of cultural resource words that are science words. Because remember, as Native people, we know our culture. And I'd like to say that you hear us talking about acronyms. You hear us highlighting laws, and it is important. And it took me a little bit to learn these cultural resource laws and understand the National Historic Preservation Act and Section 106. But what that comes down to, everybody, is reading. You have to read. That's just part of the THPO job. I mean, some of us, I'm a reader. I've always read because I grew up, when I was young, I grew up in Death Valley where there was no, because my mother's people are from Death Valley. I'm Western Shoshone. And my father's people are from Pyramid Lake. And when I would go visit as a kid, some of my grandmother's homes didn't have electricity. So we played cards and read. Everybody read to me. Somebody was always reading to me, and I'm thankful for that because I read. I'm a reader. And so part of our work is reading, and that just gives you of your sovereignty. All tribes understand their tribal sovereignty and their self-determination, and everybody does it differently, but we all know that very well. Becoming a THPO, when I first became the designated THPO, I don't know, back in 2010, 2011, you know what, the government agencies, they stood up and they listened, and they listened more. It's like, oh, what is that about? Because that's the game, as you guys know, as that the government plays. So having a better, or having a THPO that just shows up, you have to be at the table. We can't just say, look at, I just wanted to show you guys, this is a pile. You're going to get a lot. This is just, these are letters that I had to go through that don't even have to do with the Reno Sparks Indian Colony's cultural interest areas. And then I have a whole table over here, all of letters. And so you have to pick your battles too. You can't do it all when you're a one-man show. So it's very important that you read and you show up. You go to meetings. If there's meetings happening and there's even public meetings, you have to attend those. They want to see your face. They want to get used to you. So, because you know why? When we don't show up to things, then what do they say? Well, we gave you 30 days. We heard no response. And so we just thought you guys weren't interested. And so that's the point, is we just have to be visible. We have to read. And then we have to respond, and we have to continue to be a part of those discussions at the table. That's very important because that's tribal sovereignty. We are advancing that sovereignty more as a THPO to say, I'm going to be there. You can count on me. I'm going to read, and I'm going to be sure to make comments. And it sounds like a lot, but you will get used to it. And that's why NATHPO is here. We're going to help you do that. That's what NATHPO is about. And that's what I like to do, is to share that and make sure that everybody can succeed at being a THPO. It's scary, and don't get freaked out when you look at the application, because the application looks crazy tremendous, but when you go through it, you start going, oh, and once you're a THPO, when you start doing your yearly reports to the National Park Service, and when you start applying for, because we have to apply through grants.gov every year for the money, that's the easy part. That's all easy. It's just becoming a THPO designated by the National Park Service. I just wanted to say those two little things because reading is very important. We have to read. That's what this is about. You know, this is a draft environmental impact statement. You know, it's really big. we have to read cultural resource reports. They're very big, but that's okay when you read it and you don't understand it. Because now I don't have to read I don't have to read the whole thing. I know to go to the table of contents, get to what they found as the Native American cultural resources. So there's a lot of tricks that you come up with that you're comfortable with, but it's very important to become a THPO. You got to do the job, you got to do the work, and be there and be present. That's the most important. And I always tell sometimes our tribal monitor, if I just had to train them up that day and they're going out next week and I do my best to train them, and I go, you know what, just show up and act like you know what you're doing, but be present, because you will learn. Sometimes it's on the job training, and that's what we're used to. That's what we're used to as Native people. We get thrown stuff, it's on the job training. And so don't feel like, oh my gosh, this is over my head. I don't know what I'm doing, but you can do it. We can all, we're doing it. Let's do it.
I love that, Michelle. Thanks for that reminder. I think I meant to make that point at the beginning. So always good to reiterate that. I see some applause out there. Pardon my smoke detector in my background here. It's decided to act up. So I'm going to jump into the next question, and this might be all we have time for. If folks want to break, or I can queue up the next question as well, and then we can have a working break. You can come and go as needed. That's the beauty of these virtual things. You don't have to squeeze past people and lose your seat. Excuse me, pardon me, that whole deal. What does the tribal community that you represent or work with need that the Federal Preservation Program should be providing? That's what John was talking about earlier. How, and related to that, how can your THPO or the THPOs that you work with, and I added this, or the Federal Preservation Program, better meet that need? And I'm going to put that out to our panel. And mute myself.
Commensurate level of funding with the SHPOs, minimum to begin with. I also think that they need to move away from the recommendations that ACHP has, that agencies can provide funding to tribes for consultation, and should instead change that to a mandate that tribes can and will be funded by federal agencies for the consultation process. I think that if they change that, that could make a very dynamic difference and provide the available resources for tribes to actually have the ability to respond meaningfully and timely to every project that's going on in their area of interest. Unfortunately, we're probably never going to get that, but if I had a pie in the sky hope, that's mine. More money.
So I agree entirely. My thought would be that the funding would be wonderful if we could get Congress to actually allocate it directly to cover consultation, because sometimes an agency will come in like FCC and provide us funding, and sometimes it lasts a while like TCNS did, but every agency is different and they all want us to respond. When you get the THPO program, then they all want you to respond to all these projects that are located off trust land. And in a month, we can receive many hundreds of notifications. People have been THPOs for a long time. I mean, sometimes, like in the winter, we might only average 150 to 250 reviews. But like at the end of the Trump administration, my office was receiving over 400 notifications a month. There was one month which we received around 600 some odd notifications, and someone has to read, like Michonne said, someone has to read all of those. Maybe 1 out of 50, 1 out of 100 might be a problem, but if you don't read them, you're not going to find the ones that are. And somehow we have to find the time to read all that, respond to all that, and know all the laws that are relevant. And the federal government does not provide adequate funding for that. You just get funding based on how much trust land you have, which for most tribes, unless you just happen to have an extremely large reservation, most tribes get somewhere like between $50,000 to $100,000 a year for their THPO grant-ish, which is enough to fund maybe one person, sometimes two. And that's pretty much it. And you're supposed to read all these notifications and do whatever else the tribe wants you to take care of. And so I really think the biggest thing that we need is some sort of funding mechanism to handle all these off-reservation requests, because we're really only being funded to handle the on-reservation requests.
I think that there's a key here too, and as Everett was talking about, we're only mandated under the THPO agreement to review those projects within our reservation boundaries on federal trust lands, on our tribal trust lands. That's what we have to do. That's what we're acting as SHPO for. All the stuff outside, we feel the moral weight of having to do that because our tribe expects it. We know a lot of times removal tribes, that's where some of our most important sites are the places away from where we live now. And so how do we deal with that? Part of the TCNS tower thing was that they were saying that we don't need to be paid, unlike other consultants, because in reality, we are acting as consultants, giving a lot of times proprietary intellectual property rights that we have on information on places and things like that, and they're not paying for us to often know way more than archaeologists do about these places, especially places that aren't archaeological places, because a lot of these places are not archaeological. They're natural formations, they're rivers, or things like that aren't archaeological sites. So I think and the thing is also, that was just the FCC. There's all these other HUD and FAA and all these other kind of agencies that have never paid us anything for any of these things. I think we should go double barrels out with being aggressive on this stuff and say, you all need to pay us. If it's not within the mandate of what we're paid for, which is on our reservation on trust lands, anything outside, we're acting as consultants. Now it's our chance or opportunity to review these things outside, and that's great. But reality is, if you want information for us, things that will protect you from future litigation, then you need to actually pay us as consultants on materials that only we have intellectual property rights about. So I think we need to be a little bit less defensive and go on the offense on some of these things. Say, you need to pay us just like any other consultant. That's kind of my perspective on this, and it should be every single agency, not just the FCC or whatever. It should be all the state ones. It should be all the private ones. And it will be up to us sometimes if we know someplace and they're not going to pay us, maybe to say, hey, you know what? By the way, you just went into a burial area, and guess what? Without asking us, you just got yourself into a situation. And we need to have maybe some kind of a alliance between the THPOs and stuff to have some kind of a litigation fund when we run into something that's going to give us good precedent legal cases, so that they have to straighten up. I think maybe we need to look at something like that too. Because really, in essence, I kind of grew up in the 70s, and I think it was James Welch, the writer, said the Indian lawyer was the current warrior, and I would say THPOs are also a warrior today for our people.
I just want to jump on what Mr. Foster said and said tribes should be making the advocacy. Having said that, as a federal employee now, as a regional archaeologist, I will just hazard that with be ready to hear we only need to make a reasonable and good faith effort to identify. If you don't want to consult, that's not our responsibility. So there will be pushback from the agencies. Be ready for that. Be prepared. Have your counsels ready if you're going to take those harder lines. And do what your community needs to do the advocacy. The other thing is that if the agency reaches out to you and they're asking to consult, they should be asking to identify historic properties of cultural and religious significance tied to your tribe or to the Native Hawaiian community. And if they're not specifically soliciting for that identification, they're not doing a meaningful consultation. And furthermore, if they want that identification, that is a service that they're requesting. So there is your consultation. And you could posit back the question and saying, we're ready to provide such information and the identification if there are properties, but in order to do so, you would have to fund us in order to do the background research necessary with your proposed project. So this is where knowing the CFRs and the laws can really be helpful in structuring your arguments back against those agencies. So in this case, you could push back to the agencies and say under 36 CFR 800.2 CBII, if you want to identify historic properties of cultural and religious significance tied to our community, you will need to provide funding for us to do such inventory within your APE.
And please just to make sure everyone knows, you can do that. You can ask for it, but as he made clear, they don't necessarily have to fund you for that. They only have to make a reasonable and good faith effort. And there's actually been a court case where the court decided to say that, no, we don't have the ability to force a research fee. You can charge a research fee, but they don't have to pay it. And you can tell them, we won't respond unless you pay it, and they might pay you. But if they don't pay you and you don't respond, then they have the ability, they can say, we made a good effort, and they can move on and do their project without talking to you anymore because they made a good effort to try to talk to you.
They can make that argument. Whether or not it settles in court or whether it feels right to the community is a completely different animal. But
that's true. But the court cases, like at least half the court cases when it go to court, the court usually ends up siding with the agency on that.
You know, I'd like to say too that we as Native people too, we have to remember, and I seen something come up in the chat about we have to reverse the roles. And I take a look at, we reverse the roles because as THPOs, we're teaching those archaeologists, we're teaching those federal agencies that for far too long, and possibly before the 1700s to the present times, scientists and the curious have had its opinions on natives through measuring, testing, analyzing, radiocarbon dating, dissecting, setting chronology, recording, flotation, sampling, and other destructive analysis to study and opinionate on Native culture. So we turn that around and let them know, you know what, no more. We're at the table now, and that if that's what you're gonna do, we are gonna have a say about that. We have to start to understand and decolonize archaeology. We have to decolonize the interpretation of what archaeology has done to Native people. We've become, and this goes broader and bigger because archaeology has had a big play in helping to have US citizens and traditional public schools think of what Native people are. That's why we've become one part, this is just one section of why we've become a stereotype, why we've become mascots. Why these opinions and theories say we came from the Bering Strait. We stayed up there in the ice area for 10,000 years because we waited for the ice to melt and then some of the tribes came through. We're at the table now to change those attitudes because those attitudes are embedded in college students. It's embedded into traditional schools. It's embedded into anthropology. It's embedded to government employees. It really is. So we have to remember that it's not only that we have to follow these guidelines, we also have to retrain those folks of who we are as Native people, because cultural resource management is a business. It's a business. And so we have to be able to, as THPOs and as cultural resource managers and as cultural bearers of the community or of your tribe, that we have to retrain and rethink what people think of us as well. Because that's what we've been. We've been put on display. We've had opinions and theories on us, and it's time to also to re-educate people. And that's what we've been trying to do here. And that's what THPOs have a good part in doing. And that's the fun part of being a THPO.
Oh.
Okay, great discussion, everybody. So on our agenda, we have a break at this time, but I'm really enjoying this myself, and I confess that I just took a break to go figure out what was beeping in my background. So I'm gonna propose that we continue the discussion, and if you need a break, mute yourself and go take one, and we will keep rolling through since we've only budgeted this to be a few hour block anyway. Great answers to that question, everybody. And here is another question to stimulate some discussion. What are the opportunities and challenges For regional, and I threw in national coalitions such as NAPO, and collaborations, and for also THPO partnerships with agencies and with other groups. So that's basically a kitchen sink approach. But what are some opportunities in that realm, and also some challenges?
So I'll throw one up, and actually I'm going to throw, Val, the one that you and I worked on as an example of kind of how a THPO can sometimes leverage something that is unexpected and get funding. In this case, I was the THPO at Grand Ronde for my own community, and we got a solicitation from a contractor that wanted us to identify all of the TCPs and important cultural places on the Oregon coast to our community, because they were doing an ethnographic overview for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management for offshore energy development. So being the normal flippant young man I was at the time, my response back to them was to write a proposal for work, and I sent them a bill. And thinking that was going to be the end of it, they instead forwarded it off to Boehm, who drafted a contract. And the next thing I know, came to me and said, hey, would you like to do this project? And we want to pick a couple more tribes to do it as well. Lo and behold, we ended up getting NOAA on board to administer the funds, and the Macaw THPO and the Yurok THPO, as well as ours, worked with each of our communities to do case studies to identify and characterize our own tribal cultural landscapes as they attach to the Pacific Ocean and our areas of interest, and to kind of give examples of how that kind of work could be done and how to consult with tribes for agencies to do that, and came out with a larger case study. So we did get some funding for that, and it did help us actually do a large amount of characterization, because we use that as leverage to bring in actually a large number of unpaid interns through the local universities, who we had go through all of our ethnographic information, including all old histories that we had recorded from tribal members that had not been looked at in 30 years. And we went through and did keyword searches and geo-referenced everything and had large maps, and were able to identify resources, hunting locations, gathering places, places where people went for traditional foods and medicines, the whole thing across our area of interest, and just for that project. And it was quite phenomenal. But it did start out as a bit of a lark, you know, as kind of trying to jab an agency back in the eye as the THPO. But you know, thinking about that, it is important that if tribes see something coming down the pipeline, maybe be inventive and throw the proposals back at the agencies that they need to rethink about how they're approaching this. And rather than having an outside contracting agency, maybe they need to hire intertribal consultants to do the ethnographic overviews for their large projects, so that the tribes are actually telling their own history. And even if they're not doing all of the archaeological survey, they're the ones helping develop the context for how the stuff is going to get done. That can help make sure that tribes are making what is the determining elements that are the contributing factors to those sites being eligible on the National Register, right? Because that's really the trick, is getting that conversation topic to get those sites protected and to get them important in the states and in the federal agency's eyes.
Thanks, Eric. I do always tend to use that project as an example of collaboration that keeps on giving.
I'd like to say that, look what we've done here as THPOs. We've built, well, NAPO has built this great coalition, collaboration, does some great work back in Washington, D.C. And then just all of us, NAPO has great yearly conferences. And even though this year, because of the pandemic, it had to be, you know, Zoom and an online platform, it was really good. Also, what I'd like to say is that I grew up in Death Valley, like I told you guys, and we were down there, and nothing but the language was spoken. And then I don't speak the language, but I was in it every day. And I remember, it's the National Park Service, and I remember going, and I remember the National Park Service would come down to the village. We called it's the village. It's really the reservation. It's a little village. And we lived in adobe homes, and the Park Service would come down and pick up my mom and the elders, because my mom could interpret, and we would go visit sites. And I'd get in the car because I was a little kid, and so we'd go visit sites. And I say that is because when I came to Reno, I didn't know too many of our cultural sites. I went away to college, I came back, and since I've been a THPO, or since I've started to manage cultural resources, the program, I know all these great sites, beautiful sites, important sites, ceremonial sites. In Reno, we're a city. I take the young people, I take the Unity, the young teenagers, and we visit writings on the rocks, our coyote writings, and those are petroglyphs. And there's just some in Reno, they're right in Reno. And I tell the young people, you know what? The animals were doing selfies before it became very popular, because the animals, they were the ones doing selfies on the land base. And so I bring that up is because it gives me the opportunity, or our THPO program, the opportunity to share with the community all these important sites that have been taken away from us because we live in the city. And so I've been building a coalition with our own community, with our own elders, with our own tribal citizens, with our young people. And we get a big old giant 52 passenger bus. And if we can make it, we go all over and visit all these sites. We go to Lake Tahoe because we represent our Washoe tribal members that are in our tribe. And we've driven in the big bus around Lake Tahoe. We've gone to Fallon because Fallon people are Paiute and Shoshone, and that's who we are too. We're all related. And so we go to Pyramid Lake and we go way out to the pyramid. So I like to say that building regional and national, but it's also building a really good coalition with your own people. We're visiting our old sites that were taken away from us and no longer their federal property or their state property. And that's very important. And here in Reno, it's kind of easier because, well, what I was going to say on the regional, we belong to several coalitions here in Reno. One Truckee River, from Lake Tahoe flows the Truckee River 121 miles down to Pyramid Lake. We're all connected in that way, and the Truckee River flows through Reno. And so I sit on this coalition of people protecting and managing, and agencies protecting and managing the Truckee River, because nobody cared about it when they built the city around Reno, and took the natives away from the Truckee River. And we've been building that coalition to get our people back to the river. So it's building opportunities, and very challenging to build those levels at your local, in your tribe. That's really important. And that's when your tribal folks, they understand it. It empowers them. It makes them feel good, but it also shows them like, hey, we're not only city Indians, but it's very important to get to our sites. That's very important. And once your community begins to support that and understand, because before they're like, what's Michonne do over there? She's got a fancy desk and, I don't see her doing anything. And so, but then when you show that and share that, it builds for you, and it builds for the program, and it builds your community. That's what's most important, I feel, for us here. And that's just one way of collaborating locally within your own community. I hope that all makes sense.
In addition to the partnerships with federal agencies and the partnerships that Michonne was discussing, I want to mention that, and we've already touched on this slightly, but the THPO and the Advisory Council are critical partners for any THPO, especially a new THPO. Your state office, especially if you're from a removed tribe, you may have multiple states in which you're consulting and dealing with, and multiple state historic preservation officers, and it's critical to develop a good relationship with them. And part of that, it allows you to know what the state's doing. Many times a federal agency will provide funding or a grant to an applicant, at which point the applicant may assume consultation responsibility. And there is a method for them to do that under 36 CFR 800, but you may be dealing with someone who actually isn't a federal employee, unfortunately. And they may not know the laws that well, and they're just trying to get their project pushed through, and they send it to the state. And if you don't have a good relationship with the state may say, sounds fine to us, and you may never hear about it. And it's critical that you have a good relationship with the state. The state can walk you through a lot of processes that they do. In addition, for those who may not be aware of it, there's the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, who, when there's a need to interpret a specific portion of the regs, or if there's a need for guidance on a specific project, they step in. They're a federal agency that's supposed to be basically an arbitrator. And you need a good relationship with them, and you can go to them and ask them specific questions. Like if you're not understand, for example, 36 CFR 800, I keep quoting it. Every THPO needs to learn that. There may be parts that don't make sense to you. You might read it 5 or 6 times and you just cannot figure out what the heck it means. Well, the ACHP is the person that you would ask. And usually they already have guidance established and written to interpret what you need. And they can just send it to you and say, here's this 2-page paper that explains in more layman terms what this is talking about. But those are 2 critical partnerships that every SHPO should develop. Excuse me, every THPO should develop.
Okay, thanks everybody. That was really great discussion in a collaborative way. We are so grateful for everything that you are all bringing to the table here. It's very informative for me. I'm hoping it is for all of our participants, judging by the chat box. It seems like it is. So thanks everyone for keeping the discussion going there as well. I'm really trying to picture how we'll go back to in-person meetings after this. It's kind of cool to have two discussions going at once that are related. So if you haven't taken a break up to this point, we've decided to push through since we only go for another hour formally, and then we'll have leave the line open for a social time. So please do take a break if you need it, except for Michelle and Eric and Everett. I mean, obviously if you need it, but we're going to jump into the 3 o'clock session. How does a tribe or a nation create a THPO?